I don't think the horror genre is specifically limited to just the traditional horror movies, like slashers or something more like The Conjuring is an easy example, where it's a lot of jump scares and stuff like that. I think that the horror genre is way more broader than a lot of people like to talk about. And there is some movies that I actually think are the most disturbing films ever made that aren't technically labeled horror movies, but I fully believe they are on the level of horror movies, and I really feel like people should only refer to them as horror movies. I don't think there's a single better example of this than Seven. I truly believe that that is one of the most disturbing films ever made, and it's one that just really makes you super depressed watching it, especially that ending. But seeing what happens in Seven, so much of the stuff is just so hard to sit through, especially because of not what they show you, but what it's implied. And don't get me wrong, they show you a lot of stuff. But in case you don't know what Seven is, basically, just to sum it up real quick, there's a serial killer going around, and each one of his victims is based off the seven deadly sins. And it follows the two detectives trying to solve it. And I think one of the hardest scenes to ever sit through was the one when they got to Lust, because that scene, it's basically the guy is talking about what he went through, and I've never felt so uncomfortable in my life than watching that scene. But also just like gluttony, the things that that he had to go through, or sloth, genuinely one of the best jump scares ever was in Seven with Sloth, and it's the perfect example of what I'm talking about. I want to lump these two get together because they're both kind of the same reasons, but I want to talk about Come and See and Threads. So, Come and See, I've talked about this on the channel before. It's a war film. It's from the Soviet Union back when it was still kind of hard to get movies made that weren't legitimate propaganda. And so this one had a long history of trying to get made because it isn't a propaganda piece. But it's not a special type of story. It follows a kid who joins the Russian army and fights in World War II. That is one of the hardest movies I've ever had to sit through. That the whole thing is just one gut punch after another. And I think that's another reason why Threads works really well. So with Threads, it's basically nuclear war happens and it follows like people in Britain. And like the movie starts out as just like watching them live their lives and stuff, and then the nuclear war breaks out and it's so difficult to sit through. I think they both work for the same reason in that they show the most horrifying effects of war. And I'm not even talking about like Saving Private Ryan shows some really terrible effects because of war. Or same with Steven Spielberg's other film, Schindler's List. But I think what truly sets this off into the edge of horror is like how there's this whole other level, specifically with Come and See, about just the disturbing nature of it and how much it's trying to shock you. And I talk all the time about how movies aren't good because of shock value. There has to be legitimate meaning behind this. And whenever you make some of the most shocking movies that actually work, it's because there's deeper meanings behind of this. And that's why Come and See works so well. It's because it takes this whole other level of shock value and so much dread that you experience watching this journey. Another movie that people don't talk about nearly as enough as they should is Nocturnal Animals. There's a scene, I'm just going to say this, there's a scene on a highway, a very long scene, and I legitimately think I don't think there's a single moment where I was breathing subconsciously. I every time like I feel like I'd start to lose oxygen to my brain because I was holding my breath. There's I've never seen any horror movie do that to me ever, and Nocturnal's Animals did it. It's legitimately one of the most horrifying scenes of any film ever, and that's saying a lot. But also, there is good jump scares in this. There's really not a lot, but whenever you do, it's one of the best examples of a jump scare that comes out of nowhere with no build up. And a lot of the times in horror movies, it ends up being really bad because that's what you're going into. You're going into knowing that it's a horror movie, and then you get a lot of jump scares that are like that. Those don't work all the time. However, if you have a movie with one, maybe two jump scares in it, and that's the one time you use the jump scare, it works perfectly because not a single person who went in and watched this movie was expecting that jump scare. It makes perfect sense for why it happens. It's so absolutely brilliant. And again, not enough people talk about this movie, and I get that a lot of people can hate the ending. I personally love it because I think a lot of people misunderstand the ending. It's a movie one of these days I want to make a full video about because I truly obsess over this film so much because I love everything it did. But hey, you've made it this far, so I mean, if you've watched this far into the video, I mean, like and subscribe. I mean, I do all these sorts of videos. I do videos about all different types of topics, movie news, movie reviews. So, I mean, if you've actually somehow managed to make it this far in the video, like I said, subscribe and like the video. Show all your support. And I just wanted to give this quick message in case you forgot to like or anything, but I won't go on too long. Let's go back to the video. 2001: A Space Odyssey is universally agreed on that it's a sci-fi film. There's not a single person who's arguing against that. I'm not arguing against it either, but I want to say the third act of this movie is 100% a horror movie. Are there a lot of jump scares? No, there's not really any jump scares, but it 100% plays out like a horror movie about watching a AI kind of gain control. Especially like there's some scenes that like actually like it's really impressive how like whenever things go completely quiet, it scares you the most. And if you've ever seen the movie, you know what scene I'm talking about. But also just how scary Hal is. He's genuinely a terrifying antagonist, and he makes for some like really intense scenes, some really scary scenes, and the whole Stargate sequence. How could you not say that's cosmic horror? That is exactly what cosmic horror is. I've never seen a better example of how to portray cosmic horror in a movie because it's very hard to portray it in a movie. But they managed to portray it in a film so perfectly, and it's genuinely a terrifying experience the longer you think about it. And it's hard to argue that that third act really is just a sci-fi horror film. This one is a little bit of a stretch, so if you disagree with me, I fully understand why. But I'd say that Prisoners also counts on this list. I think it's more about the anxiety and just this you are scared the entire time about like what's actually happening, and there's a lot of fear that you have in this movie, but also a lot of the cringe factor that comes into horror movies. I'm not talking about like, ooh, that's bad. I'm talking about like, oh no, no, no. It's like it makes you feel like super tense and like you're wanting to look away from the screen. And the scene I'm specifically talking about is the hammer scene where Hugh Jackman's beating the sink in front of the guy. Again, you understand what I'm talking about if you've seen the film. But even just like the scenes of like what Hugh Jackman does is genuinely terrifying, and it makes you scared about like what's he going to do next because you don't know if the guy that he's doing this to is actually the bad guy or not. And it terrifies you the entire time. I was terrified at least watching it, and it's a genuinely good example of like a horror thriller. Again, if you disagree with me on that, I fully understand it. I can see your side for why you wouldn't consider this as a non-traditional horror movie, but for me personally, that's how I viewed it. That's how I felt the entire time, and that's really how I just thought about it. Maybe a film that not a lot of you have watched, but you have to watch is Perfect Blue. That it's really more the second half of the film when it really goes into like that psychological horror element of it, because this movie was never really advertised as a horror movie, not really, but I do consider it to be its own unique non-traditional type of horror movie. Same thing, like I didn't include these David Lynch's films on the list because they're technically considered horror movies, but I'd prefer to categorize him in more of a non-traditional type of horror. He really has his own unique style of horror, and that's the same thing I'd say about Perfect Blue. I really think especially like that final 30 minutes was one of the most like mind-bending intense things that have happened, and you have no idea what's going on, you have no idea what's real, what's fake, and that's what I think works most about this film is that you kind of lose that sense of knowing what's actually going on, especially that last line when like I didn't catch it at first because like I was like so out of it by that point, but when I reread about talking about that line and like it really like made me wonder like what is actually going on, because that's the perfect example of a movie that just you have no idea what's happening and it's kind of better because of that. But also just the stuff about like how fans see their idols, and it's genuinely scary seeing the stuff that happens to this girl. And I again, it's considered a horror movie kinda, but I consider its own unique brand as being along that line of non-traditional horror movies that I'd put with 7. But let's end this on a more classic note, a movie that I think we can all agree on. That's Jurassic Park. I mean, the T Rex sequence alone, genuinely one of the scariest scenes for any PG-13 movie ever made. It's impressive. Like, how scary Steven Spielberg can make his movies. But Jurassic Park really does teeter on that edge of, is this a horror movie or is this a action adventure sci-fi film? It's really hard to sell, and I think that's what I love so much about it, especially because so much of us have that terrifying memories of watching this as a kid. And I didn't watch this in the theater, obviously. I'm not old enough to have had that experience, but I remember watching that T-Rex sequence as a little kid and being like so anxious about it and just so terrified. It's really one of the better horror movies to watch as a kid. It's the same line with like Coraline, where like it's a good starter pack for like horror movies when you're younger before you actually get into legitimate horror movies like, I don't know, Martyrs. But I think it is a good just starter for a horror movie, and not even just the T Rex sequence, the velociraptors and so much of the stuff that happens in this film. It's genuinely so scary, and I'd consider it to be a non-traditional horror movie because really, I mean, what's the arguments that it's not? But I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you agree with me, disagree with me? I mean, what would be your own list of your favorite non-traditional horror movies? And I mean, if you've enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, share it if you want. I mean, you made it this far, clearly you liked it. So just so you show your support. I mean, it always helps out. I always greatly appreciate it. It genuinely means a lot to me whenever somebody likes this video. And yeah, I mean, that's really all I have to say. I mean, if you want to see a part 2, like, comment down below if you want to see another part to this. And that's really all I have to say. So until next time, it's movie talk. See ya.